I'd always trusted my wife, Claire, completely. Trust had been the bedrock of our marriage for 12 years, through every storm and triumph. We had built a life together, full of love, laughter, and dreams of a growing family. But I'll never forget the day when I began to notice the cracks in what I thought was an unbreakable foundation. It started innocently enough. Claire seemed distracted, often glued to her phone or whispering in hushed tones. She blamed work stress, and I believed her. She was an attorney, and her job was demanding. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, who was I to question her? I spent my own long hours managing my family's construction business, often leaving little time for deep conversations. One evening, I came home to find Claire and my younger brother, Mike, laughing over a glass of wine in the living room. Mike had recently moved back to town after a nasty breakup. I was happy to give him a place to crash temporarily in our guest house while he got back on his feet. It felt good to help family. What I didn't know was how much of a threat Mike would become. Their camaraderie seemed normal at first. Claire was friendly and outgoing, and Mike, with his easygoing charm, made people comfortable. But something began to gnaw at me, a feeling I couldn't quite articulate. It was the way Claire's eyes lingered on him, just a little too long, or how her laughter seemed lighter, freer, when he was around. I buried my unease, blaming my exhaustion for turning me into a paranoid fool. The pivotal moment came on a Saturday night. Claire had planned to visit a friend for dinner, and I decided to head over to Mike's guest house to watch a game. As I approached the door, I heard muffled voices, Claire's voice. My heart sank, and for a moment, I froze, unwilling to believe what my instincts were screaming at me. I knocked, my hand trembling, but no one answered. Instead, the voices fell silent. When Mike finally opened the door, his face betrayed no guilt, only surprise at seeing me. Claire, however, was nowhere in sight. I asked if she'd been there, and he hesitated for just a moment before answering no. Something about his tone didn't sit right. That night, the seed of doubt grew roots in my mind. I didn't confront Claire immediately. I told myself I needed proof, though deep down, I dreaded what I might find. Over the next few weeks, I became more observant. Claire's late-night texts and sudden changes in schedule were no longer brushed aside. I started noticing patterns, Mike's errands coinciding with her supposed work obligations. Then came the text message. One day, Claire accidentally left her phone on the kitchen counter, and it buzzed with a notification. The message preview made my stomach churn. Last night was incredible. Can't wait for the next time. It was from Mike. In that moment, the weight of betrayal crashed down on me. My wife and my brother, two people I trusted most in the world, had crossed a line I never thought possible. As I stood there staring at the phone, my hands shaking with rage and heartbreak, one thought consumed me. This wasn't going to end quietly. The rest of the day passed in a haze. My chest felt hollow, as if every breath was laced with shards of betrayal. I couldn't unsee the text message. It burned in my mind like a cruel brand. But instead of confronting Claire or Mike immediately, I held back. I needed to think, to plan, to process this hurricane of emotions. Claire came home late that evening, her smile as radiant as ever. "Hey, babe," she chirped, placing her bag on the counter. She leaned in to kiss me, and I let her. My stomach churning at the thought of her lips having been on someone else's, on his. I played along, feigning normalcy, even as her words started to sound hollow and distant. "How was dinner with your friend?" I asked, my voice deceptively even. "Oh, it was great," she replied, launching into a tale about how her friend's baby had taken its first steps. I nodded, pretending to listen, while a darker part of me wanted to shout, "Why do you lie so effortlessly?" Over the next few days, I continued my charade. I went to work, shared meals with Claire, and even played the role of the supportive older brother to Mike. But behind the scenes, I began piecing together the truth. I checked our phone records and saw an alarming number of texts exchanged between Claire and Mike at odd hours. I installed a discreet security camera near the guest house and, within 2 days, captured video evidence of Claire sneaking over late at night. Watching the footage was like ripping open a fresh wound. The image of them embracing, laughing, and disappearing inside Mike's guest house was seared into my memory. It wasn't just the physical act that hurt. It was the intimacy they shared, the kind of connection Claire and I used to have. I wanted to confront them right then, to scream, to demand answers. But something inside me stopped. A confrontation in the heat of anger would give them the upper hand, allow them to twist the narrative. I needed the power to end this on my terms, and for that, I had to be patient. I began preparing my revenge quietly. My first step was securing our financials. Claire and I had a joint account for household expenses, but I kept a separate savings account, a lesson from my father who always said, "Hope for the best but prepare for the worst." I moved most of the funds from the joint account into my personal one. Next, I reached out to a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Evelyn. I didn't sugarcoat the situation when we met. "My wife is cheating on me," I said, my voice flat. "With my brother." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "And what do you want to do about it?" "I want to leave her with nothing," I said, my jaw tightening. "She betrayed me, and she's not walking away unscathed." Evelyn nodded, her expression hardening with determination. "Then let's make sure she doesn't." She advised me to gather more evidence, messages, pictures, financial inconsistencies. She also suggested I avoid any confrontation until I had everything locked down legally. I didn't need to be told twice. At home, I played the role of the oblivious husband. Every time Claire kissed me goodbye or said she loved me, I felt my anger grow, but I kept it buried under a mask of calm. Meanwhile, Mike carried on as if nothing was wrong, his carefree grin making me sick. I began to realize how much I had underestimated him. He had always been the charming one, the golden boy who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. And now, he had stolen the one thing I thought was mine alone, Claire. But if they thought I'd just roll over and take it, they were dead wrong. The days turned into weeks as I worked behind the scenes, slowly dismantling the life Claire thought was secure. While she and Mike indulged in their secret rendezvous, I was pulling every string I could to ensure that when the time came, the rug would be ripped out from under her feet. One night, while Claire was working late, I decided to visit the guest house. I knocked, and when Mike answered, his expression flickered with surprise before settling into a forced grin. "Hey man, what's up?" he asked casually, leaning against the doorframe as if he hadn't just spent the last hour betraying me. "I figured we could have a drink," I said, holding up a bottle of scotch. "Catch up. It's been a while since we just hung out." Mike hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping aside to let me in. The guest house smelled faintly of Claire's perfume, a detail that made my blood boil, but I forced myself to remain calm. I poured us each a glass and settled onto the couch. "You've been doing okay?" I asked, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. "I mean, after your breakup and everything?" "Yeah," he replied, taking a sip. "It's been good, you know? Starting fresh." I nodded, feigning interest. "And Claire's been helping you out a lot, huh?" Mike froze, just barely, before recovering. "Yeah, she's great. Always been supportive." I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "That's Claire for you. She's always been good at taking care of people." My tone was sharp enough to make him shift uncomfortably. As the evening wore on, I subtly probed for details, throwing in seemingly innocent comments about Claire's work schedule or her habits. Mike dodged most of them, but his unease grew with every sip of scotch. I left the guest house that night feeling a small sense of victory. He was nervous, and nervous people made mistakes. The next day, I decided to take my investigation further. I hired a private investigator, a wiry man named Nate who had an uncanny ability to blend into the background. Within days, he provided me with more evidence than I could stomach. Photos, videos, even audio recordings of their whispered conversations. The details were gut-wrenching. Mike had been feeding Claire the same lies he'd told his ex-girlfriend. Promises of a future together, plans to travel the world, and dreams of starting a family. What stung the most was hearing Claire talk about me. "He's so predictable," she'd said in one recording, laughing softly. "I can always tell when he's about to do something. It's like living with a routine." The contempt in her voice cut deep, but it also hardened my resolve. If she thought I was predictable, she was in for a rude awakening. The turning point came one evening when Claire mentioned a work retreat. She'd be attending over the weekend. I knew she wasn't going alone, and my suspicions were confirmed when Nate texted me photos of her and Mike checking into a cozy lakeside cabin. That night, I stared at the pictures for hours. The betrayal felt suffocating, but beneath the pain was a simmering determination. They'd taken everything from me, my trust, my dignity, my family. Now, it was time to take it all back. As I stared at the photos of Claire and Mike at the cabin, I knew the time had come to act. Every fiber of my being screamed for confrontation, for vengeance, but Evelyn's voice echoed in my mind. Play it smart, Russell. The more composed you are, the more damage you can do. I spent the next few days carefully finalizing the pieces of my plan. I arranged meetings with Evelyn, ensuring all legal angles were covered. She walked me through the divorce process, the division of assets, and the prenuptial agreement Claire had signed before we got married. She's entitled to far less than she probably realizes, Evelyn told me, her lips curling into a smirk. But that's only if you handle this cleanly. Cleanly, I repeated to myself. I wasn't sure if I could hold back my anger when the time came, but I would try, for the sake of a greater victory. The weekend of Claire's so-called work retreat arrived, and I stayed busy. While she and Mike indulged in their fantasy life, I made the final preparations to dismantle hers. I changed the passwords to our shared accounts, transferred all automatic payments out of the joint account, and secured my belongings. I also packed a suitcase with her clothes, leaving it by the front door as a symbolic gesture. By Sunday evening, everything was set. I sat in the living room with a glass of whiskey, waiting for Claire to come home. The house felt eerily quiet, as if it too were holding its breath for the storm that was about to break. She walked through the door just after 10 p.m., looking radiant and smug in a way that turned my stomach. "Hey," she said breezily, dropping her bag by the door. "How was your weekend?" I took a sip of whiskey before answering. "Productive," I said evenly. "Yours?" She paused, caught off guard by my tone, but quickly recovered. "Oh, just the usual, meetings, team-building exercises. Exhausting, really." I stood and walked toward her, holding her gaze. Didn't realize team-building exercises involved cabins and wine by the lake. Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of panic. "What are you talking about?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos Nate had taken. Claire's face drained of color as she stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "I know everything, Claire," I said, my voice cold and steady. "Every lie, every sneaky meeting, every moment you've spent with Mike behind my back. Did you really think you could get away with this?" She stammered, I can explain." "Explain what?" I snapped, cutting her off. "Explain how you've been sleeping with my own brother? How you've been tearing apart this marriage while smiling in my face every day? Save it, Claire. I'm done." Tears filled her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. I'd given her everything, and she'd thrown it away. "Russell, please," she whispered. "We can work through this. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" I laughed bitterly. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or burning dinner. This was a calculated betrayal. For months, years, maybe, you've been lying to me, to yourself, and now you want to fix it? "I love you," she said, her voice cracking. "You don't love me," I said, shaking my head. "You love the comfort I provide, the stability. But guess what? That's gone now." She fell silent, realizing there was nothing she could say to undo the damage. I stepped aside and pointed to the suitcase by the door. "That's yours," I said. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. Papers will be filed tomorrow. You can pick up the rest of your things from the porch. I don't want to see you here again." Claire's tears turned to anger. "You can't just throw me out like this," she shouted. "This is my house too." "Wrong," I said, my voice as sharp as a knife. "I've got the paperwork to prove otherwise. You signed a prenup, remember? That house, those accounts, all the things you've been enjoying while sneaking around, they're mine." Her face twisted with rage, but she said nothing. She grabbed the suitcase and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I stood in the silence for a long time, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. I wasn't naive enough to think the battle was over, But this was the first strike, and it felt good. The hours after Claire left were a strange mix of relief and emptiness. I sat alone in the house, the silence around me almost deafening. For the first time in years, I was truly alone, and it was both liberating and suffocating. A part of me wanted to celebrate, to revel in the fact that I had taken back control, but another part of me, the part still clinging to the man I used to be, mourned the loss of the life I thought I had. The next morning, I met with Evelyn. She was impressed by how thoroughly I had prepared. "You've got everything you need to ensure this divorce goes smoothly," she said, leafing through the folder of evidence I'd provided. "Now we just need to serve her the papers." "Do it as soon as possible," I said. "I want this over with." Evelyn nodded. "I'll have a process server deliver them to her today." By the time I left her office, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The wheels were in motion, and Claire's fantasy world was about to come crashing down. But there was still one loose end, Mike. That afternoon, I drove to the guest house, my fists clenched around the steering wheel. I wasn't sure what I was going to say, but I knew I couldn't let him walk away from this unscathed. When I arrived, Mike was outside, working on his car. He looked up as I pulled into the driveway, his expression guarded. "Hey," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's up?" I stepped out of the car and slammed the door behind me. "We need to talk." Mike's face hardened. "Look, if this is about Claire—" "It's exactly about Claire," I snapped, cutting him off. "You slept with my wife, Mike. My wife. And you thought I wouldn't find out?" He dropped the rag and took a step back. "It's not what you think." "Don't insult me," I growled, taking a step closer. "I've seen the texts, the pictures. I know everything. You betrayed me, Mike. You're my brother. How could you do this?" Mike's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, he looked genuinely ashamed. "I screwed up," he admitted. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did." I stared at him, my anger boiling over. "That's your excuse? It just happened? You've been sneaking around with her for months, maybe longer, and all you can say is that it just happened?" He looked down at the ground, unable to meet my eyes. "I'm sorry, man. I really am." "Sorry doesn't cut it," I said, my voice shaking. "You've destroyed this family. You've destroyed any trust one had in you." "What do you want me to say?" he asked, his voice rising. "That I'm a terrible person? That I regret it? Fine, I do. But what's done is done." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "What's done is done," I repeated slowly. "You're right. And now, you're done here. Pack your things and get out." Mike's head shot up, his eyes wide. "You're kicking me out? You think you can stay here after what you've done?" I said, incredulous. "You're lucky I haven't knocked your teeth out. Consider this the merciful option." He hesitated, his jaw clenching. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll go. But for what it's worth, I really am sorry." I didn't respond. I turned and walked away, leaving him to pack his things. As I drove back to the main house, a strange sense of closure washed over me. I'd taken the first steps to reclaim my life, and while there was still a long road ahead, I was ready to face it. That evening, I poured myself a drink and sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small glimmer of hope. The worst was behind me, and now it was time to rebuild. Not just my life, but myself. The days following Claire's departure were a whirlwind of emotions and paperwork. Evelyn worked quickly, ensuring every legal angle was covered. The divorce filing was airtight, leaving no room for Claire to challenge the terms. She would walk away with nothing but her clothes and a car, if she was lucky. Meanwhile, Mike moved out of the guest house within 24 hours. True to form, he left a mess behind, as if his hasty retreat mirrored the chaos he'd brought into my life. Watching him drive away with his beat-up truck stuffed to the brim gave me a bittersweet sense of victory. One problem down, but the bigger storm was still brewing. Claire didn't take the news of the divorce well. The moment she was served, my phone lit up with calls and messages, each one angrier than the last. I ignored most of them, letting her voice drip venom into the void. When I finally answered one evening, it was only because I wanted to hear how she'd justify her betrayal. "How could you do this to me?" she screamed the moment I picked up. "After everything we've been through, you just throw me away?" "I didn't throw you away, Claire," I said coldly. "You did that the moment you decided to crawl into bed with Mike." Her voice cracked. "I made a mistake, Russell. Can't you understand that? People make mistakes. You don't get to call it a mistake when it lasted for months," I shot back. "You didn't trip and fall into this. You planned it. You lied. You schemed. And now you're paying the price." There was a long silence, and for a moment, I thought she might hang up. But when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more calculated. "You think you're so righteous, don't you?" she said. "But let's not pretend you're perfect, Russell. You've always put your work ahead of me, always treated me like an afterthought. Maybe if you'd paid more attention, this wouldn't have happened." Her words hit like a slap, but I refused to let her see it. "Blame me all you want," I said. "It doesn't change what you did. You destroyed this marriage, Claire, not me." Before she could respond, I hung up. The conversation left me shaken, but it also reinforced my resolve. Claire was grasping at straws, trying to shift the blame onto me. But no amount of deflection could erase the truth. 2 weeks later, Evelyn called with news that turned everything on its head. "Claire's lawyer contacted me," she said. "It seems she's decided to contest the divorce." I frowned, gripping the phone tighter. What grounds could she possibly have? "The evidence is overwhelming." "She's claiming emotional neglect," Evelyn said. "And there's more. She's accusing you of withholding marital funds." "What?" I barked, anger surging. "She's the one who cheated, and now she's trying to make me the villain?" "Unfortunately, it's a common tactic," Evelyn said calmly. "She's hoping to force a settlement that's more favorable to her. But don't worry, we're prepared for this." The thought of Claire painting herself as the victim made my blood boil. She was already trying to rewrite the narrative, casting herself as the wounded party in a story she had authored. It was a cruel twist of the knife, but I refused to let her win. The next few days were filled with depositions and meetings, each one draining but necessary. Evelyn assured me that the evidence was still overwhelmingly in my favor, but Claire's accusations made the process messier than it needed to be. Meanwhile, word of our separation began to spread among friends and family. Most people were supportive, but a few, including my own parents, took a more neutral stance. "She's still your wife," my mother said one evening during a tense phone call. "Maybe you should hear her out." "She stopped being my wife the moment she slept with Mike," I said bluntly. "If you can't see that, then maybe you're just as blind as I was." The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. My parents had always doted on Mike, excusing his mistakes as youthful indiscretions. Now, their loyalty to him felt like a betrayal of its own. As the legal battle dragged on, I found myself growing more determined to hit Claire where it hurt the most, her pride. Evelyn and I began gathering every piece of evidence that painted her as the unfaithful, manipulative woman she truly was. Every text, every photo, every recording Nate had collected would be used to dismantle the facade she had built. I also began reaching out to her social circles. Quietly, discreetly, I let it slip to mutual friends why our marriage was ending. "I didn't want to say anything," I'd begin, feigning reluctance. But Claire's relationship with Mike, well, it wasn't exactly brotherly. The reactions ranged from shock to disgust, and by the time the gossip spread back to her, Claire's once pristine reputation was in tatters. Her attempts to contact me became more frantic, her messages swinging wildly between rage and desperation. But I didn't respond. She had made her bed, and now she would lie in it, alone. The cracks in Claire's carefully curated life began to widen. As news of the affair spread, she became increasingly isolated. Friends who had once admired her charm and wit now saw her through a different lens. Her calls for sympathy fell on deaf ears, and the smug confidence she once wielded was replaced by something resembling desperation. Mike wasn't faring much better. Without the safety net of my generosity, he was forced to move into a shabby apartment across town. His attempts to reconcile with me, weak gestures of apology and half-hearted texts, were ignored. I had nothing left to say to him, and as far as I was concerned, he was no longer my brother. But Claire wasn't finished fighting. Her lawyer filed a motion to contest the terms of the divorce, claiming I had emotionally neglected her for years. The idea was absurd, but it gave her just enough leverage to drag out the proceedings. Evelyn was confident we'd win, but she warned me that the process would be exhausting. She wasn't wrong. The day of the first hearing arrived, and the tension was palpable. I sat in the courtroom, flanked by Evelyn, as Claire and her lawyer entered. She looked composed, but I could see the strain behind her eyes. The woman who had once been so poised now seemed like a hollow version of herself. Her lawyer presented their case, painting me as a cold, distant husband who had prioritized work over his marriage. He claimed Claire's actions were the result of a lonely woman seeking connection, a narrative designed to elicit sympathy from the judge. It was nauseating. When it was Evelyn's turn, she dismantled their argument piece by piece. She presented the evidence of the affair, texts, photos, videos, painting a stark picture of Claire's betrayal. She also highlighted the financial stability I had provided, the vacations I had planned, the countless ways I had tried to make our marriage work. By the time Evelyn finished, Claire's lawyer looked visibly deflated. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, didn't seem impressed by Claire's claims of neglect. The turning point came when Claire was called to testify. Evelyn's cross-examination was brutal but fair, forcing Claire to admit to the affair and acknowledge the financial benefits she had enjoyed during our marriage. "You claimed emotional neglect," Evelyn said, her tone even but firm. "Yet you continued to accept gifts, vacations, and financial support from your husband. Is that correct?" Claire hesitated, her lips trembling. "Yes," she said quietly. "And during this time, you engaged in an extramarital affair with his brother. Is that correct?" Her voice cracked. "Yes." The courtroom fell silent. Claire's facade crumbled, and for the first time, I saw genuine regret in her eyes. But it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no going back. The judge ruled in my favor, upholding the terms of the prenup and awarding me full control of our shared assets. Claire was left with little more than her clothes and her car, a far cry from the life of comfort she had taken for granted. As she left the courtroom that day, she avoided my gaze, her head bowed in defeat. Mike's role in the affair wasn't addressed in court, but his reputation was equally tarnished. Word had spread through town, and he found himself ostracized from both our family and his professional circles. The golden boy had fallen, and no one was rushing to pick him back up. Despite the legal victory, I didn't feel triumphant. The end of the marriage marked the end of a chapter in my life, a chapter filled with love, trust, and dreams that had been shattered beyond repair. The house felt emptier than ever, each room a haunting reminder of what I had lost. But as the weeks passed, I began to rebuild. I threw myself into work, rekindled old friendships, and even started therapy to process the anger and grief. Slowly, the weight of the betrayal began to lift, replaced by a cautious hope for the future. Claire tried to reach out once, leaving a voicemail full of tearful apologies and pleas for forgiveness. I didn't respond. I'd given her everything once, and she had thrown it away. There was no room for her in the life I was building now. After the court ruling, I realized that winning wasn't the end of my journey. It was the beginning of something new. The divorce may have ended the marriage, but the scars of betrayal ran deep. I couldn't ignore the pain, but I could control how I responded to it. I started with small steps. I cleared out the house, donating or discarding anything that reminded me of Claire. The guest house, once tainted by Mike's presence, was converted into a workshop. Creating something tangible with my hands became an unexpected form of therapy. Each swing of the hammer felt like a release, each completed project a reminder that I was still capable of building something meaningful. Friends who had been distant during the chaos started reaching out, offering support and encouragement. "Come join us for a drink," they'd say. "It's time to move on." I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I forced myself to go. Slowly, I began to rediscover the joy of connection, of laughter shared over beers, of moments untainted by betrayal. One evening, as I was finishing a project in the workshop, I heard a car pull into the driveway. When I stepped outside, I was shocked to see Claire standing by her car, looking hesitant. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my tone cold. She fidgeted with her purse, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I know I'm the last person you want to see, but I needed to say this in person. I'm sorry, Russell, for everything. I folded my arms. Sorry doesn't erase what you did. I know, she said, her voice trembling. I've lost everything, my friends, my reputation, my home, and it's all my fault. I wanted you to know that I regret it. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy, but then I remembered the months of lies, the look in her eyes when she thought she'd gotten away with it. You regret getting caught, I said bluntly. Not what you did. She flinched but didn't argue. I'll leave, she said softly. I just needed you to know. As she drove away, I felt no satisfaction, only an emptiness. Her apology came too late to matter. The fallout extended beyond Claire. My parents, who had always favored Mike, were struggling to reconcile the truth. My mother called me one evening, her voice hesitant. Russell, she began, I've been thinking about everything that's happened. I can't believe Mike would do this to you. Believe it, I said sharply, and don't expect me to forgive him. He's still your brother, she said, her tone pleading. Not anymore, I replied. You don't get to betray someone like that and expect forgiveness. The conversation left me drained. I realized I couldn't control how others reacted to the situation, only how I chose to move forward. Months passed, and the weight of the betrayal began to lessen. One day, while at a local coffee shop, I struck up a conversation with a woman named Lily. She was warm, kind, and refreshingly honest. We talked about everything: life, work, the struggles of starting over. For the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of something new. We exchanged numbers, and over the next few weeks, we grew closer. Lily wasn't perfect, but she was real, and that was enough. Mike made one last attempt to mend things. He showed up unannounced, looking disheveled and remorseful. I screwed up, Russ, he said, his voice raw. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know I'm sorry. I stared at him, the man who had once been my brother but was now a stranger. Sorry doesn't fix this, I said. You broke something that can't be repaired. I'll never trust you again. He nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. I understand. And just like that, he walked away, disappearing into the night. It was the last time I saw him. Claire officially moved out of town shortly after the divorce was finalized. Mutual friends told me she was trying to rebuild her life, but I didn't care. I had no interest in her story anymore. My focus was on my future, not her past. Evelyn called me one day to let me know everything was settled. You're free now, she said, her voice laced with satisfaction. Free. The word felt like a breath of fresh air. For the first time in years, I could breathe without the weight of betrayal on my chest. Lily and I continued to grow closer, but I took things slow. I wasn't ready to jump into another relationship without fully healing. Therapy helped me process the anger and grief, and I began to see myself in a new light. I wasn't just a victim of betrayal. I was someone capable of surviving it. The workshop became my sanctuary. I started selling custom furniture, turning a hobby into a small business. Each piece I crafted felt like a step toward reclaiming my identity. 1 year after the divorce, I stood on the porch of my house, watching the sun set over the horizon. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined me. I was stronger now, more resilient, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hope. Lily walked up beside me, her smile warm and genuine. What are you thinking about? She asked. Just how far I've come, I said, slipping my arm around her shoulders. The road to healing had been long and painful, but standing there with Lily, I realized something important. The past didn't own me anymore. I had taken back my life, and for that, I was grateful. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt ready for whatever the future held.